Hi, in today's episode of the STEM Signal, we're going to ask the question, who's making the decisions in your situation and how do you tell? Hi, this is Jeff Goldfinger. Welcome to the STEM Signal, where we help the STEM educated increase their career signal among the workplace noise. This is our 11th episode, and today we're going to learn about how to raid the room. So let's get down to business. All right, the title is about raiding the room, and we're going to use the HBO miniseries Succession as our way to navigate how we raid the room. Now, you'll see RAID as all capital letters, which, for those of you who've seen my channel in the past, know that means I have an acronym ready to help you memorize the 4 basic roles in the decision-making tree. So, it's a RAID. Okay, not that kind of RAID. So RAID, the first letter is R, so that's the recommender. So a recommender in a situation is usually somebody inside the organization with technical skill. So inside the organization, technical skill on the topic of interest, and they make a recommendation. So in the TV show, The Succession, it's Greg Hirsch, right? He's an insider with technical knowledge, but you'll notice he's on the lower end of the power scale in the organization. All right, so that takes care of R in RAID. Now we look at the A in RAID. The A stands for advisor or consultant. I couldn't come up with a good kitschy mnemonic with a C, so A for advisor. The difference between a recommender and an advisor is that they both have technical knowledge, but an advisor is from outside the organization, usually someone you're paying for their expertise. Now, psychologically, that automatically increases their relative power in terms of making recommendations to the decision maker. It has to do with the fact that you're paying for their services and you don't want to think of yourself as paying for something you're not going to use. Now, you're also paying the salary of a recommender on the inside, but psychologically, you don't see that paycheck every week, right? So it's often the HR domain, it's automatic payroll is happening behind the scenes. So it's not as present to you as actually writing a purchase order to bring in an outside advisor or consultant. So again, they both have the same level of technical knowledge usually, but one of them, again, the advisor is going to have more strategic awareness. Think with a bigger picture because they've worked with a lot of other organizations like yours, but on different issues. So they're going to have a more strategic focus. That's also why they tend to have a little more power when they make their recommendations. Okay, so in Succession, we might consider Lucas as the influencer. Now, nobody's paying Lucas, right? He's the CEO of a media firm, but he's an outside advisor who's able to get his way with the board of directors, right? So that makes him, in this scale anyway, much more powerful than the previous character, Greg, that we talked about. All right, so that takes care of R and A. Now we got to get to I. So I is influencer. The influencer is somebody who's a close confidant of the decision maker. Usually, it doesn't really matter whether they have detailed technical knowledge of the topic at hand. In fact, it's often the case the recommender or the advisor has greater technical knowledge, but on the power scale, the influencer has more because they have that personal relationship with somebody. And in most cases, again, psychologically, we tend to trust somebody that has a personal relationship with us over somebody who has more technical skill. That's a function of this neurotransmitter called oxytocin. For a lesson more about that and how we build trust using this neurotransmitter, there's a really good book out there by Paul Zak. I've mentioned that book before. Paul Zak, it's called The Moral Molecule, and he studied the role of oxytocin in trust building. So when we have strong personal relationships, we tend to trust more than just somebody having pure technical knowledge. So in the TV show, Gary Kelman's character is probably the one who's an influencer. Now, as a lawyer, she also has great technical skill, not necessarily in media, but because she has a strong personal relationship with Logan and now Roman, tends to be higher on the power scale than either the recommender or the influencer. All right, finally, we have the decision maker. And obviously, in this story, we're talking about that Logan Ray's character. But the reason I want to talk about the decision maker for a moment is most of the time, we always hear, I got to get you in front of the decision maker. I want to go see the decision maker if you're in a sales role as an engineer, let's say. Or I want to make sure I get my paper to the decision maker. Sometimes that's not always the best way to do it. Sometimes it's better to go through an influencer. So the key is to understand how to recognize when you see all four of these roles, right? So when you see the decision maker, it's best, hopefully, when they're in a room and you're briefing them and they have their entourage, it's best to notice who they're looking at, who they're listening to, who they're having their private conversations with. Notice which role they play, right? Influencers tend to sit left or right of the decision maker. The recommenders tend to sit in the back of the room, sometimes along the walls, right? Advisors, kind of the same thing. So there are skills to notice, and practicing how to notice this is to your benefit if you want to increase your own STEM signal. Now, by the way, it's also useful to note where you are in this role. Many of you could be outside advisors, right? You're an educated engineer or a scientist that's been asked to come take a look at something, right? So you could be an advisor, you could be a recommender, you could be an influencer. So not only is it important to notice the roles that other people are playing, recognize where you are on this rising scale and how much relative power you have. Okay, so that's why I call this rating the room. And in summary, go ahead and take out a piece of note paper and let's quickly review what I just went through. So the recommender is a skilled insider with the lowest relative power in the four categories I'm talking about. Domain expertise is technical and they think tactically, as opposed to the advisor who has also technical skill, but they tend to be a strategic thinker because of the exposure they've had to other problems like yours or situations or other companies. And their relative power is between the recommender and the influencer. So the influencer has a close personal relationship, could be an outsider, right? So one example I know from my own history in the 80s, we had a president in the US, President Ronald Reagan, and his wife had a lot of influence over him, even though she was technically an outsider in terms of she wasn't technically a government employee. She didn't have any technical skill involving the government, but she did have a big role in swaying President Reagan's decision making, right? So she was a good example of an influencer that was technically outside the wheels of government. So the last is the decision maker. Now, I've been talking about a decision maker as if it's a single individual. Sometimes we have a committee that's the decision maker, and on that committee, you have a number of different personalities. So sometimes you'll have to, in episodes 9 and 10, I talked about catering to the left. LEFT, leaders, egoists, friends, and thinkers, the four behavioral types. Again, the link to that is in the description below. And so if you have a committee that's making the decision, you might have to cater to all four, but recognize the committee is still going to have the most power among all of that. All right, highest relative power. And the domain expertise is variable. So let's take a look at Steve Jobs and the early days of Apple, right? Wozniak had most of the technical skill. He had some, but for him, it was more about design. He then brought in the former head of Pepsi. When he brought Scully into Apple, Scully had no technical knowledge, but he was still a decision maker for the company as a CEO. Now, contrast that today with Elon Musk and Tesla. He's an engineer by education, and by some measures, he knows way more technically about all of his companies and his projects, whether it be Tesla, SpaceX, the Boring Company, than many of his employees. So now you have somebody who has tremendous domain expertise in the greatest position of power. And again, I make no judgment about that. I'm just letting you know you need to observe both types and adjust accordingly. All right, so now let me give you a real world story that happened to me so you can see how this works in a corporate environment. Everything I'm about to tell you is way more than a decade old. This happened in the late 2000s when I worked for a large defense contractor. At the time, they were the 10th largest in the world. I'll reveal their name in a moment. And much of what I'm about to tell you, there's a little inside baseball here, but much of it can actually be found online if you're a little sleuthy, and you can look it up, okay? Mobius. What was Mobius? So at the time, I was hired as an advisor by this big company to help them with entering the unmanned aircraft systems domain, right? They had all of the piece parts. They had communications equipment, they had the sensor balls, they had some avionics. They wanted to get into the game as a provider of full unmanned aircraft systems. So as an advisor, I said to them, look, you can shortcut that by this aircraft called a Mobius. At the time I discovered this Mobius, it was working on an Air Force project using a long EZ derivative called a Berkut. This small company in California had teamed up with an avionics manufacturer on an Air Force project, and so they were flying one of the first optionally piloted aircraft. The aircraft, when I say optionally piloted, the aircraft could fly with or without a pilot on board, and when the pilot was on board, it could be flown completely from the ground, either autonomously via pre-programmed routes or at a ground control station with somebody actually putting in stick and rudder commands. Why would you want to do it that way? Well, at that time, not to get too technical with you, it was very costly for unmanned aircraft systems companies to rent military airspace. That was the only way to safely fly these things and still have the what's called the see and avoid capability, so an unmanned and a manned airplane wouldn't run into each other. By putting a safety pilot on board this optionally piloted aircraft, you could save the expense of renting military airspace. So it's a pretty slick idea, and it was a way to accelerate the development of somebody's system. All right, so fast forward about 6 months after I made this recommendation, I get hired by the company for other reasons, don't have to go into that, but I get picked up by the company as an employee. Now, I was told, okay, you're so fond of this Mobius thing, go turn it into a multi-divisional project within the company. The first time this company had ever done that. They were a holding company, and so every division was incentivized to work for their individual benefit enterprise value, not necessarily to cooperate and coordinate with each other. So this was going to be a first. The other issue is I got to go ask for money because we're going to turn this into a project. We need money from the group president. There were 4 groups in the company at the time. All right, so my biggest problem is now that I'm an employee, I actually have lower power than I did when I was an advisor. So fortunately, I found an influencer to help me. The boss, the group president's deputy, the VP for business development, had his ear. Now, he didn't know as much as I did about unmanned aircraft, but he certainly knew our boss. Okay, I'll call him JD at the time. My friend and mentor was an influencer for JD, and so I gave the presentation. The mentor helped me with the presentation. We got our funding, boom, aircraft shows up. Many months later on, we paid for the establishment of the first ever L3 branded optionally piloted aircraft. And you can see on the screen, you'll see the sensor ball from L3. There's some avionics inside. We obviously have the L3 logo, and we have the pilot flying the aircraft. Okay, so now we have a proof of concept of this R&D project. Now we want to go outside the group and make it a corporate-wide project. So we go to the CEO, and now we have to go to the board of directors because the board now becomes the outside advisors, right? The board of directors had lots of expertise in multiple areas because some of them were retired military general officers, generals, and admirals. Many of them actually owned other companies, some even related to unmanned aircraft. So they had expertise as outside advisors. Now, I'm kind of kicked off the whole, I was still involved in the project, but at that stage, I'm no longer even a recommender. So now we have a team of folks doing the recommending. We have my mentor becoming one of the recommenders. And now JD, who was earlier the decision maker, now becomes the influencer, trying to make it a corporate level project. And sure enough, some number of months later, it shows up on the cover of our annual report. That's why I said this is in the public domain. You can actually look this up. This was the first time ever that L3 had put an R&D project on the cover of their annual report. Their annual report, as a publicly traded company, required by law to submit to the SEC. So again, you can look all this up, but the progression of this and the changing roles throughout this sales cycle. Now, I'm putting up the sales cycle here. I don't want you to get too wrapped around the axle about the cycle itself. I actually use this in one of my other corporate classes. But what I want you to recognize is that we had to go around the loop multiple times, right, to get more and more funds. Initially, I was hired by my mentor as an advisor, so I had to convince him. And then once we got to JD, and then we have to go to the CEO. So the roles are changing. Rating the room is changing every time we had to go higher up the chain of command. All right, so what are the key takeaways of today's lesson? Practice rating the room. Recognizing who you are and who your colleagues and peers are in the decision-making tree is a valuable tool for you. Getting to the decision maker isn't always the best. Again, in that Mobius example, I found it far more effective for me to work with the influencer than directly with JD. All right, as always, if you found this content valuable, please like and subscribe. But as always, to increase your STEM signal, it's best to actually recommend this to others. This has been Jeff Goldfinger. Thank you very much. I look forward to giving you episode 12 in a week. That's going to be an exciting lesson on risk seeking and risk avoiding.